past 50 years, the guitar has come into its own as a remarkably popular and versatile instrument. In this program, we look at two successful Australian guitar manufacturers. First, a factory of 13 workers in Melbourne, where a number of traditional techniques are used, and then a small guitar making business in the country, which has adopted microchip technology. The Maton Company was started in 1946 by Bill and Vera May. In fact, the name Maton is short for Maytone. Bill May was responsible for the development of an astonishing range of instruments, which, in spite of fierce competition from well-known imports, eventually received acceptance and indeed acclaim from Australian musicians. The factory, now managed by the Mays' son-in-law, Neville Kitchen, is located in the outer Melbourne suburb of Bayswater, where around 1,800 guitars are produced in a year. Timber arrives in rough form, and it's at this stage that we can look at the first issue to confront the guitar maker. Although some instruments have been made using materials such as fiberglass for the body of the instrument, wood is still by far the most popular construction material. Bill May was very interested in investigating the use of Australian timber for instrument making, but the company now uses mostly imported wood.
A lot of the Australian timbers just aren't suitable for guitar making. For example, you have to use spruce on the face, and that's, you know, basically there's only two sources, either European spruce or Canadian spruce, and we get ours from Canada. It's a Sitka spruce, which is a particular species. The sides, we vary. Some of them are Brazilian mahogany, and we get Indian rosewood for the back and the sides in some of the more expensive models. We get Indian rosewood for the fingerboards. The necks are mahogany. And then in some of the less expensive models, we do use laminated, which is a sapelli mahogany on the outside, laminated. And we do use on the very cheap, or the relatively cheap job, that we use a laminated spruce top, which we import. So that, generally speaking, all the, you know, the materials, the timber is imported.
An interesting irony here is that although musicians are often involved in environmental protests, the guitars they use when they sing their songs are often made from exotic rainforest timber or from other species that are now in short supply.
Well, it's getting worse and more scarce. I think the spruce that I got last time has gone up by something like 40% from the previous shipment, which was probably 3 years ago that we got the last lot. So that's a worry. Brazilian mahogany is getting very, very scarce, getting good quality mahogany. Rosewood is also getting scarce. So in terms of the long-term future, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think basically a lot of the problem lies in the fact that the Japanese are buying up huge quantities of this material. So they've made a big dent in the supply of it, so we've just got to get it from where we can, basically.
The process of changing this timber resource to a guitar involves the use of another very important resource, and that's people. First, the wood is broken down into appropriate sizes. And then it's machined to the shape of the various components required. The assembly of the instruments is mainly a hand operation and involves staff originally trained as cabinet makers, but who now have developed years of experience as guitar makers. It's interesting to note that this is a craft which appears to have attracted few women.
I don't know the reason why. I suppose that traditionally, I suppose cabinet making's been a male domain. I suppose it's just the old story. It's as long as they can do the job, there's no reason.
In most similar industries, the need for these kinds of hand skills is gone because of the move to almost total mechanisation. But it's this aspect of Maton's operation that has been responsible for the company's reputation for quality.
I suppose you'd say that there'd be 30 or 40,000 guitars imported into the country each year. And I think, you know, out of that 30 or 40,000, most of them would be in the cheaper end of the market, the, you know, sort of below $500 mark, I suppose. And we would pride ourselves that we've probably got, you know, 80% of the top end of the market, I'd say, or more.
The quality of Maton instruments is something that retailers no longer have to try to convince their customers about.
Someone that's bought a Maton in the past will always go back to a Maton, and someone that hasn't had a Maton will pay for the difference from a manufactured guitar to a handmade guitar. They're very aware that they will pay for quality.
Bill May was responsible for much of the initial development work at Maton, including the adoption of microwave drying of timber, a process developed with the assistance of the CSIRO. But these days, finding people to turn to for advice can be very difficult when you are the largest player in a very small game.
When you're the only people doing it, it makes it a bit difficult to go to source out information. I mean, we sent Bradley away to Tech to learn about spraying, and he knew more than they did. So, you know, guitars are so unique that, you know, one finds that people think they know things about them, but they don't. So a lot of the information we have to do, basically, we, you know, try and get it from within if we can.
A good example of using the company's own resources has been the recent and relatively simple upgrading of a number of manufacturing steps. These wooden machines used for many years have been replaced with faster and safer designs using metal. This tray for glue dipping has replaced the use of a brush for fixing this strip of timber into the guitar neck. And a single redesigned clamp is used instead of 3 separate clamps. Simple improvements, but a number of similar problem solutions like this have increased the factory's output by approximately 15% in the last year. Unlike the range of products made by Maton in the 1950s and 60s, the product range is now less diverse, but minor changes in design are made to suit fashion and the pockets and preferences of guitar players.
I think people are always looking for new models to be made. I mean, in the last 4 years, we've probably introduced about, you know, probably 15 to 20 different models. And, I mean, some of the changes are cosmetic because, you know, they might have a guard, might not have a guard plate, they might have a guard plate, might have a cutaway, mightn't have a cutaway, different machine heads. So generally, pickups and not pickups, so colours, cosmetic changes like that. So that we have, you know, to change models probably like once a year or something like that.
One compromise that is made to keep the price of the Maton guitars to an acceptable level is the surface finish of the instruments.
We probably don't fare as well in terms of the finish as perhaps the imported ones do because of the fact that they have these machines that can do it. I mean, and they're, you know, $200 and $300 guitars are all, you know, not hand polished, but they're all polished and shining. And it's the old story with when the cars came into this country, they had all the gadgets, but the same thing happens with the guitars. They look the part, but they don't particularly play that well and they don't sound that well. So I think that, generally speaking, ours sound and play well. And I mean, the finish is acceptable. It's not, you know, when we do the satin finish because it's off the gun, it's less time involved.
Promotion for the products tends to happen mainly by word of mouth and reliance on the reputation that Maton has built up over 40 years for good-sounding quality products. And while the export market is seen as the goal for many Australian manufacturers, Neville holds little hope in this direction.
The problem with exporting is that we are an unknown brand overseas, and unfortunately it's not reciprocated where Australians seem to know virtually every brand that's made overseas, whether it be motor cars or guitars for that matter. But it's not reciprocated, and you know, if we go to America or Japan or Europe, I mean, a sprinkling of people would have heard of Maton, but not, you know, by comparison, the number of people in this country that would have heard of Fender or Gibson, it just doesn't relate. And that's one of the problems. The other thing is that it's an expensive product to begin with, so therefore by the time you get it overseas, distributors and involved, it sort of probably becomes 4 times more expensive than it is here. So that's a bit of a problem.
Another Australian guitar maker, who incidentally is more hopeful about the export market, is Ian Noyce in Ballarat, about 100 kilometres from Melbourne. Ian made his first guitar as a teenager in his father's workshop after watching his brother follow plans taken from an American Popular Mechanics magazine.
I guess at sometime later in the early 70s, I became quite obsessive about building myself an acoustic instrument that was to suit a particular band I was playing in, that had to get over play notes on top of a banjo and stuff like that. So I wanted a sort of a small lead acoustic guitar. And I was fascinated by the challenge to make something that didn't appear to be available on the marketplace. I couldn't see it wouldn't work better than the standard folk boom 60s dreadnought guitar, which was lovely for singing with, but no good for playing over banjos if you want to play single note stuff. And I just got hooked.
After a number of years spent working with his father, a builder in Mildura, Ian started an engineering course as a mature-age student, but turned to instrument making and repair after a back injury forced an end to his studies.
I had a couple of opportunities to make instruments for top-class professional players that I'd come across socially, and it just fell into place there. All of a sudden I found myself battling away, working one-handed and cutting my other all the time with a chisel, supporting my bad back, carving out mandolins and things. And it just followed on from there, really. And I had this advantage of having a fair background in the sciences and engineering, and I had very good contacts, close friends, musical friends that were physicists and statisticians, mathematicians and scientists of sorts, and I used to drive them crazy with some of my questions and so on. We did a little bit of postgrad research work on the subject of acoustics too. So it all just fell into place over a fairly intense few years, and been doing it ever since.
Like Maton, Ian makes acoustic guitars, but is better known for his solid body electric instruments. Once again, a lot of imported timbers are used, but Ian is very keen to use the local product.
We have some wonderful woods here, and just unfortunately they're not well known about, not only here but elsewhere, and perhaps they're becoming better known overseas. For instance, the Japanese just love our Australian blackwood. And of course it grows all around the place right here on our property. We've got heaps of blackwood, some of which we've used in our guitar production. And that's where we think the future is.
This instrument is the first that Ian has made entirely from local woods, with the sides fashioned from fiddleback blackwood.
The fingerboard there is wandoo, very hard wood from Western Australia. The back's poplar, which was grown in Kempsey, New South Wales, which isn't an Australian species, but hell, it was grown here. And the plank down the centre is myrtle and silver ash. And we're doing various simple experiments, testing standard samples of these various species of wood, and that's just basically hitting a piece of wood and listening to it and so on, and taking some measurements, and that's giving us a good insight of how to change our recipe to incorporate more Australian woods. And this we think is important for our drive to go into selling our guitars on the world stage rather than just locally.
One problem with our local timbers is the lack of knowledge about their special properties and recognition of their high potential value.
It's really just a matter of time and tradition that people in the crafts business that are using these woods need to, as they discover them or discover the uses, let the timber industry at large know the value of these things. So it's happening, change is occurring, but of course this is a worldwide problem of people not appreciating all of their wood resources.
The timber used for making guitars needs to be very stable so that the instruments don't warp and become unplayable. This means making sure that the wood is dry. At the Noyce workshop, the timber drying room is an old railway carriage that is a part of the workshop where heat, and humidity are controlled. But how do you know when the timber is dry enough?
There's a simple test for that. You take some shavings off a piece of wood, run it over the buzzer, weigh the shavings, dry them out in the oven, compare the weight, and you've got the percentage moisture content of the wood. And they'll start off at anything up to 60 or more % moisture, water in the wood, but by the time it's properly dried, most woods are around about, let's say, 10% moisture content.
At Maton, there is a more high-tech approach to this procedure. They use an electrical device with probes that penetrate the sample so the moisture content of any piece of timber can be rapidly checked. It's actually measuring the electrical conductivity of the wood, and this is directly related to the amount of water present. But in another area, Ian is using far more sophisticated technology than the larger factory. Ian Noyce has developed his own computer-controlled machining tool. The cutting tool, in this case a router, has its movement controlled in 2 directions. And when the table on which a piece of timber is mounted is also moved, the position of the cutting tool can be located anywhere in 3 dimensions. Usually, the machine is directed by drawings of guitar cross-sections generated on a Macintosh computer.
Well, that all started when I guess I was pushing a piece of wood around the router or against a router and a pin routing setup one day, and decided this just wasn't good enough. It was too old-fashioned and low-tech, and if we were to retain our interest as guitar makers, we needed to become more efficient and have better technology. And what really inspired them building the machine was simply, we had the Macintosh here, we're doing guitar designs and drawings on it, I'm printing them out on the printer here. And I thought, well, why not build a thing like this, like the printer, and a giant printer, and then instead of having a printhead on it, we'll stick a router machine or a router on it. And essentially that was the beginning of it. We had to find...
It took 5 years to develop the system now in operation, and it involved finding someone who could build the computer that actually controls the servo motors moving the tool and the table. It is also developing an appropriate software system which has ended up being a new area of expertise for Ian's offsider, Dave Newton. Machines of this type are not new, but this one is smaller and a much cheaper alternative to anything that is commercially available.
To make guitars, you'd need to spend $500,000 on such a machine that was made in Italy, Germany, or Japan, most likely. That was clearly absurd for us and out of the question. So we've sort of got one that cost, say, a tenth of the price, and it's probably got about a tenth of the productivity, and it's still only working for us about a tenth of its time. So the technology isn't new. However, the simplicity of it and the simplicity of our software is perhaps somewhat new. It's a relatively new language, and it's relatively low-cost computerisation compared to what the big stuff is. Built for Australian conditions.
The development of Ian's machine, although very successful, has also created a problem. It is capable of making many more rough-shaped guitar bodies than he can handle.
Certainly, it means we could produce 1,000 guitars a year. With our present staff, we could only put together and finish off 100 guitars a year. So the machine's lying idle most of the time. But even then, it's still worth having it, even though it's not being properly financially utilised. I think in time it will obviously get more and more work, and this is clear. We're getting all sorts of other jobs for it. We're building wooden heads for the millinery trade called hat blocks, shaped like a human head. That used to be done by a firm in Melbourne that died out, but it's something we're well equipped to do. And there's various other odds and ends that we're making across different industries, just because we've got a computerised machine that is efficient at doing small job runs of all sorts of things.
The use of the computer-controlled cutting machine for guitar making simplifies the initial job of rough-shaping guitar parts. But this doesn't reduce the craft skill involved in the rest of the process.
We can use the computer machine to do all the basic machining, routing, slotting, that sort of stuff. So we've got one precision machine that does a great many different jobs that have got to be done by some sort of electric tool. It's a precision tool. And that leaves us then with all the hand crafting stuff, the final carving and shaping and sanding and finishing and setting up to do by hand in the traditional method. So I think we've got the best of both worlds.
This best of both worlds begins when Ian and his computer go to work on the initial design of an instrument, be it acoustic or electric.
And the great thing about electrics in one sense is you've got a lot of sculptural freedom, but the design problems therefore come into being able to have one guitar that does everything. It's got to be fantastically comfortable and beautifully balanced. It's got to be easy to play from one end of the thing to the other. Where you put the routes for cavity controls, bridge posts and the pickup routes and stuff like that, all of these things will affect the sound.
Ian's instruments are gaining quite a reputation among musicians, and like Maton, he is selling because of word-of-mouth recommendations from users of his guitars. But he also has a talent for business and has an additional income from the wholesaling of a popular line of guitar pickups and the manufacture of miniature guitar trophies. These larger volume, cheaper items help to offset the less predictable sales of these guitars, which are produced in very limited numbers and fetch a high price. It's one thing to be a talented craftsperson, but down-to-earth business skills are vital.
I guess the hardest thing in running a good business is making sure people pay their bills. So many businesses can fail because they just don't get on the phone and say, look, will you please pay your bill unless you have a problem, you're overdue. So across the board, yes, you need to have good business sense, understand the figures of business, to understand whether you're winning or losing. And if you forget about that because you're too tied up in making new guitars or something, you can very easily come a cropper.
Another dilemma for many smaller businesses is to find, train, and be able to keep suitable employees, especially when specialised skills are required.
We've found it very difficult to get people that can fit in and we can afford to train. It's just so very difficult to make it pay. There's so much to learn. It's so difficult to train someone. It takes so long. And in a small firm, in a small country, you don't have the continuity of work where you can teach somebody fretting and that's all he does. Whereas in a bigger factory, say in the US or the Orient, if you're in a guitar factory and you're fretting guitars, you'd be doing that all day. We're not really like that. We're not really aiming to be like that. We need people that can cover a fairly broad part of doing it. And you just don't get people like that overnight. So it's very difficult to get people started because of the cost of wages and the cost of living and so on. And ideally, I believe in our sort of game, not to mention I believe in many others, we might well be better off with young people leaving school at a younger age so that they're less expensive to train, so that by the time they're mature age of 21, they've had maybe 6 years experience working and they're actually you're going to be able to afford to pay them an adult wage for their work.
Ian also prefers employing people who are musicians themselves.
Yes, another problem with guitar making, I find, is that the most capable people at the latter stages of assembling and painting and setting up guitars need to have experience playing professionally. It's just very difficult to have a good all-round feel of what it's about and how these things work, and this includes acoustic guitars that for customers that aren't necessarily going to be playing them professionally, but a professional musician has a very good feel for guitars, somewhat akin to a professional guitar maker, and they're often one and the same person to some extent.
The cost of employing the right people is a factor that keeps the price of an item like a Noyce guitar high. But like Maton, Ian doesn't believe that the competition he has to worry about most is the cheap import.
The products that we're competing against really are expensive imports. I mean, our guitars really fit into the top-end price brackets from sort of $1,500 to $3,000. So So we're really competing with the $2,000 to $5,000 imports. The less expensive imports really just cover the bulk of the market, and that's not surprising. Our problem is there's a very small market in Australia for our sort of product, which is why we have to move more into the exports.
It's interesting that despite differences in scale and their approach to manufacture, both Ian Noyce and Maton are an example of a local product gaining success in a very competitive market by relying almost entirely on quality and surprisingly little on an aggressive marketing strategy.
The only thing we sell on is quality. The guitars sell themselves. We don't even believe that you can sell this sort of product any other way. It's different to the normal merchandising of other merchandise. The music business is different. So really the way to sell a guitar is say, try this out, mate. And when they won't give it back, you've sold it.